Before we dive into today's episode, we wanted to take a moment and thank our episode sponsor, RDG Planning and Design. RDG is a talented team of architects, landscape architects, engineers, artists, and planners with a passion for design and a drive to make a difference. They believe in applying new ways of thinking and innovative approaches to the preparation of plans that address community and regional issues. They have a network of offices in Omaha, Nebraska, St. Louis, Missouri, Denver, Colorado, and Des Moines, Iowa, with design and planning professionals dedicated to applying their talents in extraordinary ways. Check out their work today at rdgusa.com. You are listening to the Booked on Planning podcast, a project of the Nebraska chapter of the American Planning Association. In each episode, we dive into how cities function by talking with authors on housing, transportation, and everything in between. Join us as we get booked on planning. Welcome to the first episode of Season 2. If you listened to most of Season 1, you know that we had a rotating set of co-hosts on each episode with me to interview the authors. In Season 2, we're welcoming Jennifer Hyatt as our permanent co-host. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hi, Stephanie. Thanks so much. I'm glad to be joining the podcast full-time after a great first season.
Yeah, we're really glad to have you. And in addition to adding Jennifer to the show, we're also changing up our frequency. We've planned monthly episodes instead of the bi-weekly frequency that we had in Season 1, but we do hope to be able to sprinkle in some shorter articles and other literature as short episodes throughout the year as well.
Yeah, I'm excited for the switch. Switching to once a month will allow us to dig deeper into each book's subject matter and gain better insight into the topics.
So looking at today's episode, we are interviewing the author of Color of Law, Richard Rothstein, and we're joined not only by Richard, but his daughter Leah to get insight into their follow-up book, Just Action, that is coming out this summer. I will say that there's really not enough time in this episode to cover both books, but we did devote some time towards the end to talk about Just Action, and hopefully we'll be able to have them back on once the book is released later this summer.
Yeah, I really thought it was great that we had both Richard and Leah. Richard is an expert on race and education, having written many articles in addition to The Color of Law, and has a long experience with land use and race issues. But then Leah brought in her expertise in the full range of housing policy that stems more than 2 decades of experience as a consultant to affordable housing developers and local governments, and as a community and union organizer. I thought it was interesting, the pure academic side versus the experience with the consulting.
Yeah, and I think you see that coming through in their answers, where Color of Law is very fact-based, and this is what happened, while Just Action is grounded in what local activists can do, city officials and others, to address the issues brought to light in Color of Law. It's not about what can be done at the federal level with legislation, but what locals can do to make a difference in their communities.
Yeah, I felt like one of the most interesting topics that reflect this difference is the idea of the zoning and single family housing. Richard talks about it in the book, but then Leah really touches on how, getting rid of single family zoning might be one tool, but it's not the total. And it was a very different look from the academic side to Leah's perspective.
Another interesting topic of conversation during this episode was the idea that this book breaks down the stereotype that this issue was something that was only in the South, that it wasn't happening across the nation, that we were seeing redlining and racist housing policies coming out of the FHA, and none of the communities that were profiled in the book having practiced this were upset about it, but they were actually trying to work towards solutions.
I also really appreciated having the conversation touch on both The Color of Law and Just Action, because when I was done reading The Color of Law, it really opened my eyes to the injustice in land use that I wasn't aware of, even though my whole career has been around land use. And I thought that I knew it so well. But Richard really brought a lot of points to bear, and I felt ready to take action after reading The Color of Law, but there wasn't a lot of follow-up on what we can do. So I thought the conversation around Just Action really brought forth those next steps that we can take, and I really look forward to reading it.
Yeah, there's about a 6-year gap between the release of Color of Law and Just Action, so I'm sure there's a number of people out there who felt the same way if they read the book right after it was released. But there's a number of communities, and we talk about a few in this episode at the local level Minneapolis or at the state level in Oregon and California, that already started to take action with regulations that prohibit single-family zoning in their codes. But Just Action, I think, will be a really good follow-up book, though, as Leah says in the episode, it's not just about changing zoning or one thing that's going to resolve these issues, but it's going to take a multi-pronged approach to get there.
Yeah, it was exciting to hear Leah talk about tools that I know some of the cities in our state are starting to implement too, such as land trusts, and how it's going to be complementary. We'll need those tools as well as the zoning reform. With that, let's get into our interview with authors Richard and Leah Rustine.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and we want to welcome our audience to another episode of Booked on Planning, starting our year 2 with authors on topics from housing to transportation, everywhere in between. Our guests today are Richard and Leah Rustine. Richard wrote Color of Law in 2017, and Leah joined him for a follow-up book, Just Action, which should be coming out in June of 2023. Richard, can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and what spurred this book?
Sure. I was an education policy writer, education journalist. I concluded some years ago that the biggest problem facing American public education was the segregation of its schools. I came to understand that schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 50 years. And the reason is that they're located in neighborhoods that are segregated. So I began to think that neighborhood segregation was an educational problem. That's the direction I came at it from. In 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision in which the court, in an opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts, prohibited two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, from embarking on a very trivial school desegregation plan. It was going to give parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend, but in the rare case where there was a limited number of places available and both a black and a white child applied for that place, the child who had helped to diversify the school would be given some preference. Supreme Court prohibited it. Chief Justice John Roberts said that it was against a violation of the Constitution for the district to embark on such a program, because he said the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated. He was right about that, of course. But then he went on to say that the neighborhoods were segregated, and the term he used was de facto, just because of private prejudice and bigotry and the action of private businesses and people wanting to live with each other of the same race. Government had nothing to do with it. And if government hadn't created it, government is prohibited from fixing it. Well, I read this decision. This was in 2007. I remembered an incident that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, one of those two communities some years before, in which a white homeowner in a single-family home in an all-white suburb of Louisville called Shively had an African-American friend who was living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to move to a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop that either. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. The police, the courts, the prosecutors are all agents of government. This is a blatant violation of the Constitution to create segregation in Louisville in this way. John Roberts is completely mistaken about how segregation happened. I began to look into it further. I found there were hundreds and hundreds of cases, police protected, sometimes even police led and organized mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in communities all over the country, East Coast, Midwest, West Coast, as well as the South. I then looked into it even further, and I found that state-sponsored violence wasn't the only unconstitutional government policy that imposed segregation. There were many other federal, state, and local policies that were racially explicit, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area in the country. I wrote a book summarizing those policies, and that's how it happened.
And Leah, do you want to tell us how you fit in with this research?
Sure. Well, so I am by training, started out as a community and labor organizer, and then moved into working in affordable housing and community development as a consultant to affordable housing developers, nonprofits, cities and counties in California, so redevelopment agencies as well, working on issues of housing affordability and community diversity. From there, I moved into working on criminal justice reform, again, sort of with the racial justice angle to that. So I came to that background, to read my dad's book, along with the rest of the country, The Color of Law, and reading it and being, along with every other reader, sort of awakened to the history that we weren't super aware of. And the question that I had afterwards, like many others, was, well, what do we do now that we know this? What do we do about it now? It seems so entrenched and so intractable, the segregation of our communities. Is there anything to be done? So my dad started working on me to convince me to work with him on writing a sequel. So using my policy background and organizing background to research this and come up with some strategies and avenues and ideas for what we can do in our communities to redress segregation and to not only reverse what's happened, but to remedy the past harms and, make sure our communities don't continue to be segregated in the future. So that's how I came to it.
Thank you. I have to admit, while reading this book, it did occur to me that in the last, I'd say 10 or so years, there has been a deep reexamining of the impacts of systemic racial discrimination. And I was thinking about how before, about 10 years ago, I don't think that conversation ever was even brought in even the most progressive conversation circles. And now we're starting to realize that it's actually baked into the very foundational doctrine of our legal system. I'm a lawyer by training as well as a planner. And I was in law school about 6 years ago when a lot of this was starting to really be brought to the forefront. Did your guys' research happen alongside those other conversations? Did you have any impact from that? Like Just Mercy and the other books that kind of hit in the same area?
Well, the subtitle of The Color of Law is a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. And it has been forgotten. I think that some of the writings that I did prior to the publication of The Color of Law, especially after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and then Freddie Gray killed in Baltimore, Maryland, and then the publication of The Color of Law, I think started a national conversation about how residential segregation happened. I say it's a forgotten history because the policies that the government was following in the mid-20th century to create segregation and to entrench it were well known at the time. This is not a hidden history. When whites and blacks were directed to separate public housing projects, and in the mid-20th century, there were more whites in public housing than there were African Americans. When they were directed to separate public housing projects by both the federal government and by local housing agencies, they knew they were being sent to a government-sponsored segregated project. There was nothing mysterious about it. When homeowners with FHA mortgages in the mid-20th century bought homes that had in their deeds requirements that they never be resold or rented to an African American, they knew that they were in a government-sponsored segregated development. So there was nothing mysterious about this, but it was forgotten. Why was it forgotten? Well, as Leah just mentioned, once we create this kind of segregation, it's very hard to undo it. We had a civil rights movement in the 20th century that abolished segregation in lunch counters and restaurants and buses. Well, you pass an ordinance say you can't segregate a restaurant anymore, or you repeal an ordinance that requires it. The next day you go to any restaurant. You pass a law saying you can't have segregated neighborhoods anymore, and things wouldn't look much different. So it's much harder to undo once we've created it. It's not impossible, and that's what our new book, Just Action, talks about. Is the many, many ways, many things we can do to begin to redress segregation. But it's harder. And so because it's hard, what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, Democrats, Republicans, is adopted this rationalization, this national myth that we've got de facto segregation, that it was not created by government, and therefore we have no responsibility or obligation to undo it. We may think it's too bad, but we tell ourselves it would happen naturally, it can only unhappen naturally. It's not our responsibility. And I think we've adopted that rationalization because it's harder to face up to how to undo something that was so easily done, but once it's in place, it's hard to undo.
You mentioned how we started to outright ban very racist and segregated policies, but then one of the government tools that definitely wasn't just de facto was using zoning to still segregate and keep classes apart. And so the R1 single family district in general became kind of that white middle class residential area and kept minority groups from moving in. And there's one really interesting quote from the book that puts it very blatantly, that they were trying to protect against inappropriate uses, including encroachment of the colored race as part of the zoning districts. And since your book, there's been a lot of cities throughout the nation. Minneapolis is one that I'm most familiar with, having worked there, that have gone and, in essence, banned the single family zoning by removing that. And I'm wondering if you think that this is fixing the damage done by past generations, if it's a step in the right direction, or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I would say it's a step in the right direction. It's not going to fix the problem entirely. As you said, single family only zoning has been used in exclusive white neighborhoods to keep them that way, exclusive and white. Keeps property values and home costs high, keeping African Americans and others out. So banning single family only zoning is necessary if we want to open up those communities to more diversity, both economic and racial diversity. And a lot of communities have done this. You mentioned Minneapolis, although that one's now being fought out in court. Oregon has banned single family zoning for cities over a certain size. California has recently done it statewide. And these are good reforms, like I said, a step in the right direction. They are necessary to allow more variety in the types of housing in these exclusive communities. And it has the potential to bring housing costs down in those communities by allowing smaller houses and just more housing type diversity. But we don't really know yet if these changes will have that effect. None of these reforms have been in place long enough to know the true impact. We do think that allowing slightly more dense housing will bring the cost of that housing down. But still, many of these communities are very expensive. The costs are still going to be very high for even smaller homes. They still may be out of reach for many households, including many African American families who don't have intergenerational wealth to put into home buying. And they don't have that intergenerational wealth because of the very policies that created the segregation of those communities to begin with and kept them out of home buying when prices in those communities could have been affordable to them. So yes, we think that zoning reform is a necessary piece of the puzzle, but zoning reform along with other reforms like having preferences or set-asides for African Americans when new housing is built in these communities, subsidies for them to be able to afford to buy housing there. Other reforms like inclusionary zoning that requires that when new housing is built, a certain percentage of units are required to remain affordable to lower and moderate income families. That would help. Other zoning reforms like reducing parking requirements, increasing allowable building sizes or lot coverage. These all sort of have to go along with single family zoning to have the intended impact, the impact that we want. So yes, single family only zoning is necessary. It's what's kept segregation in place. And so we have to get rid of it to begin to redress it, but alone it won't be enough. We have to pass it along with additional reforms.
One of the things I really appreciated about the color of law, Stephanie and I are both from the Midwest. We're both from Nebraska. And one of the things that we hear is that this type of action, because we've considered it de facto instead of de jure, didn't happen here. Or other things that I've heard, I was like, that's what happened in the South. It didn't happen across the country. And I know that that maybe goes back partly as well to the lack of education that you mentioned at the front of the podcast. So I really appreciated that you looked at places like St. Louis, Long Island, Berkeley, showing that this type of discrimination occurred even in the Midwest or in the most liberal places that we think of in the country. But I was curious, did you face any of the backlash from communities that you profiled in the book? I know here in Lincoln, sometimes we don't like to talk about this part of our past.
Well, no, one of the encouraging things that's happened is there has been no backlash because the book is facts. None of the facts that I described in The Color of Law, the public policies, federal, state, and local policies that were racially explicit, none of those facts have been challenged. There's adequate citations to documents that show it. The quote that you read before about not having incompatible racial groups in communities that are white, that quote comes directly from a federal policy manual that was issued by the Federal Housing Administration. The manual was distributed to appraisers all over the country whose job it was to evaluate the application of builders who wanted to build subdivisions at a time when we weren't yet a suburban country. And the Federal Housing Administration was being asked to guarantee their bank loans because banks would not lend money to developers for these subdivisions. They didn't think that suburbanization was a viable plan going forward. And so the federal government issued a manual in which it guided appraisers about what kinds of applications to approve. The manual said you couldn't approve an application of a developer to build a project in which homes would be sold to African Americans. It said this explicitly. And it said that you couldn't even build a subdivision that would be all white if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, as you just said, that would lead to the encroachment of incompatible racial elements. And in The Color of Law, I actually have a photograph of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall in Detroit, outside Detroit, that a developer of a white project was required to construct by the Federal Housing Administration to separate his development from a nearby African-American neighborhood in order to get a federal bank guarantee for the construction. In our new book, let me say this, in our new book, I'm glad you brought up Nebraska. In Just Action, there's a photograph of something called a panel of Americans in the 1960s when African Americans were excluded from white subdivisions in Omaha by the kinds of federal policies that I described. A white woman, a suburban woman, within the city of Omaha, was shocked when an African American surgeon she knew couldn't buy a home anywhere in the city. And she organized what she called Panel of Americans. It was 5 women, 1 Jewish, 1 white Protestant, 1 Catholic, 1 African American, maybe it was 4. And they went around Omaha giving talks to churches and synagogues to try to awaken people about the segregation of the city and the way African Americans were being excluded from white neighborhoods. There's a photograph of that panel giving a presentation in the book, in Just Action. One curiosity is that the white Protestant woman was the wife of Warren Buffett.
It's interesting that you bring that history up, actually, from Omaha. There has been some recent conversations in Omaha regarding the interstates that were built to explicitly segregate the different neighborhoods. And one of the conversations, of course, revolves around maybe taking down those interstates to see if that will help bring those, revitalize those neighborhoods. But another conversation is actually building a bridge over the interstate to connect the neighborhoods. But once again, I think that one of the conversations that is missing is actually the people in the neighborhoods. I don't see as much that public input, once again, of how would you guys, like us as planners or as city council members, how can
we bring you into the conversation. You have a comment in the book, perhaps this was the death of planners as a profession in many ways. Maybe it's not in the book. Maybe that was a podcast I listened to about the book. There was a comment on how this particular area could be the death of planning, where we used to design and now we just follow the law. And the law is regularly de jure discrimination. So it's interesting that you bring up that panel when Omaha is once again looking at their history and maybe not learning from it.
You had been basically describing redlining in the answer to the last question. So this next one builds off of that. And we tend to think of these racial housing practices as something in the distant past that we're now trying to remedy and fix. But in the book, you bring up the reverse redlining that was really prevalent in the 2000s prior to the housing bubble. Lenders were targeting low-income Blacks with subprime mortgages that would never work out. Do you think that we're still seeing any of this still today, or have we actually learned from our mistakes and we're on the right path?
Well, I think the problems that we face today are not mostly the kinds of explicit racially targeted forms of segregation as the kind that led to the subprime mortgage crisis. Those were outrageous. They were blatantly a violation of the Fair Housing Act to target African Americans for loans when they would have been qualified for more conventional loans. But the bigger problem we face is that once you have a segregated system, even race-neutral policies can reinforce and intensify it because people are in unequal situations once we've put them in those situations, and race-neutral policies will affect them differently. So one of the things we write about in the new book is how, and I'm sure this is the case in Omaha because it's true in almost every metropolitan area in the country, how the property tax system is racially discriminatory in effect, not because property taxes say explicitly that they're going to tax Black homeowners at a higher rate than white homeowners, but because the race-neutral system of assessment has a racially discriminatory effect. And the reason is fairly easy to understand. There are many reasons for it, but one of them I think is fairly easy to understand, and that is that white neighborhoods have tended to appreciate in value faster than Black neighborhoods have. This is true all over the country. So if you have a community, and this is true of most communities, that doesn't reassess properties annually at the very least, over time, the assessments of white homes are going to be farther below their real market value than the assessments of Black homes. Homes in white neighborhoods are going to have assessments that are farther below their market values than homes in Black neighborhoods. What that means is the homeowners in Black neighborhoods are paying a higher effective tax rate. There's more taxes per dollar of housing value than white homeowners are. This is not a racially explicit policy. It's one of many, many. Maybe Leah can talk about another one. Credit scoring is another one we talk about. But these are things that require racially explicit remedies because the effect of racially explicit policies of the past on which we build race-neutral policies that can reinforce it.
I can add another example to that is where banks are located. So lower income segregated African American communities have far fewer financial institutions than middle class white communities. So it's harder for people to get loans in those communities and have bank accounts, both of which would help them increase their credit score and build up a good credit score to get future loans. So they're limited to relying on things like payday loans and not only are those types of loans highly, exploitative. They have, very high interest rates, but they also don't, if you pay those off faithfully, you don't get credit in your credit score for doing that. So it's a cycle where because of the lack of the type of financial institutions that would lead to a good credit score are lacking in these segregated African American communities. They don't have the opportunity to build up a good credit score in order to get a good mortgage or a good mortgage rate or a mortgage at all to be able to buy a home in the future. So there are reforms that can be made to that. It's not a problem that can't be fixed. If you have had a mortgage in the past and you paid it faithfully, it helps you build a good credit score. But if you've been a renter your whole life and have never missed a rent payment, which African Americans are disproportionately renters than whites, then you don't get any credit in your credit score for having been a perfect renter and never missing a rent payment or never missing a utility bill payment. And both of those could be used in the algorithms for creating a credit score. It just takes some reforms. It might take a little more work by a bank to track down that information, but it's not impossible. So that's something that there's national reforms being talked about, but at the level of the bank and each institution, they could change how they research and look into their applicants' credit and take into account their rental payment history. And that would have a big impact on those borrowers' future ability to borrow.
Let me add one thing to what Leah said. Our new book, Just Action, focuses exclusively on what people can do in their local communities. There are so many reforms that can be implemented locally that don't require federal policy. And it's too easy for racial justice advocates to focus on all the pie in the sky laws that Congress can pass to fix this that have no political support. But as Leah said, any bank that issues mortgages could take it upon itself to count the actual credit history of applicants rather than just what the algorithms that are developed nationally do. The example I gave before about discriminatory, in effect, property tax assessments, that's a purely local issue. The federal government doesn't assess properties. So the focus of our new book, Just Action, is about what local racial justice activists could do in their own communities to make big impacts on the segregation of their areas.
As an aside, I didn't realize that rental payments didn't go to building credit. I guess I've just lived an incredibly sheltered existence where I haven't had to worry about that, but that's a problem.
Well, if you think about it, the credit scoring companies, they can easily get mortgage payment records from banks. They just transmit these records to them electronically. But there are so many landlords, local landlords, some renting 2 or 3 apartments, some may be renting more. The credit scoring companies don't have a system for assembling these records. And so it's so much easier to assemble the records of mortgage payments than it is to assemble the records of rental payments. And so this easy system, not designed for race on the basis of race, but has a discriminatory effect.
Well, I do want to give you guys an opportunity. Is there anything that you feel like we didn't cover in this conversation that's a very important message that you would want our listeners to know?
So we wrote Just Action to answer the question of what do we do about residential segregation now? Over almost 1 million people read The Color of Law. Most of those people maybe hadn't thought about these issues before, maybe had never even considered being an activist or, working on these kinds of issues in their communities. So we wrote this book to reach all of those people and those who consider themselves activists or who have sort of engaged in local politics before. And as my dad said, we know that federal policy change will be necessary for these vast, improvements and interventions that are necessary to redress segregation, but that the political will on the national level just isn't there right now. But it is in our communities, we can build that political will, we could build that movement. And there's a lot that can be done locally. There's a lot that doesn't have to wait for state or national change. And so we focused exclusively, as my dad said, on local policy change and what we can do in our local communities, with the idea that as these local communities begin to organize and begin to make changes around these issues, it'll build into a national movement that then will eventually, hopefully, lead to federal national change. So we talk about building these local committees in our local communities as they must be biracial and multi-ethnic, bringing different races together to work on these issues, starting by educating themselves about how their communities became segregated, how we became segregated as a nation. And in that process, often you can identify who were the actors behind the segregation of your communities, the builders, the realtors, the financiers, bankers that created segregation in our communities, and then begin to work on how to redress that locally. And there's dozens and dozens of policies and strategies and practices that we go over in Just Action. We talk about them as both needing to be past and future focused. So we have to both ensure that we don't continue to create and maintain segregation going forward, And we also have to address the past wrongs that have happened that at the cause of our government policies that created segregation and remedy those harms. It's one thing to say, we can no longer discriminate on the basis of race in housing when many of our communities are unaffordable to African Americans who were prohibited from buying homes when they were affordable. So we have to address the wealth disparity there in order to truly remedy segregation in our communities. I can talk about a couple of examples. We sort of group the strategies that a local group can take on into two main categories. Place-based is one. And so these are strategies that are focused on improving investments and resources in segregated lower income African American communities, and also that attempt to prevent displacement as resources in those communities increase. So gentrification is one of those examples. So as resources in lower income communities increase and they become more desirable and more expensive, and the longtime residents are threatened with displacement and being priced out, there's strategies like rental protections for renters to protect them against rapidly increasing rents or unjust evictions. Inclusionary zoning, again, is a policy that can help in gentrifying communities by ensuring that as new market rate housing is built, some of the units are reserved as affordable to lower income families. Another place-based strategy is a land trust. So a local group could support or help start a land trust. And land trusts work by acquiring property or land, building or rehabbing houses on it, and then selling them at affordable prices. And in the sale, the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house, and that's how it keeps the house price affordable. And so when they sell the home to a lower moderate income family at an affordable price, the family then agrees that when they resell it, they will abide by a formula that the land trust establishes for the maximum price they can sell it for. And that formula balances the need to build some equity for the selling family with the need to keep the price affordable for the next buying family. So a land trust can be used as a place-based strategy to prevent displacement and provide affordable homeownership opportunities in those communities as they begin to increase investment and become more expensive. And the other category we talk about are mobility strategies, and those are concerned with opening up exclusive white communities to diverse residents, and also preventing white flight as those communities start to diversify and maintaining them as integrated places. So one mobility strategy we've been talking about is zoning reform, abolishing single-family only zoning in those communities. Another that we talk a lot about is concerns Section 8. So Section 8 is a rental voucher for lower income families. For many reasons, those families who receive Section 8 vouchers are usually limited to using those vouchers in lower income communities. But there's a lot of changes that can be made on the local level that would make it easier for those families to use Section 8 vouchers in higher opportunity areas, in exclusive suburbs, for example. Changes to how the voucher amount is calculated so it's worth more so they can afford units in higher cost areas, and to prevent discrimination against voucher holders. And these are all local level policies that a local group could advocate with the Public Housing Authority or the local government to make these changes and allow mobility for voucher holding families. A land trust could also be used as a mobility strategy. If the land trust could acquire land in an exclusive white suburb, for example, it could build affordable homeownership opportunities that remain affordable forever and that allow people who've historically been excluded from those communities to afford to live there. That would require the local government of those communities to donate land to the land trust. And there's often a lot of opportunity for this in exclusive suburbs. There's vacant school sites as public school enrollment declines, or we have examples in our book of a vacant golf course or a vacant country club in communities that the cities are trying to figure out what to do with. And those could easily be donated to a land trust who could build affordable homes on them and open up these mobility opportunities in those exclusive neighborhoods. So those are a few examples, but the book is full of them. And it's not a prescriptive book. We can't tell every community what to do first, but the point is that there's nothing that can be done. There's a lot of options. It depends on each community's sort of history, interests, current issues to decide what the most important thing is to start with, but there's a lot to do.
I always like to try and shout out local partnerships when I can. And NeighborWorks Lincoln here in Lincoln, Nebraska has actually created a land trust within our community. And they just sold their first 4 units in their land trust. So we're really excited to see how that will move forward with the other housing actions that Lincoln's taking.
That's great.
This has been a really great conversation, and I'm excited, and hopefully we can organize another chat for an episode later this summer after the book's released, and we have an opportunity to dive in and look at all the different solutions and have you both back on. If there's any other parting thoughts?
Well, I have a parting idea, if I could say so.
Yeah.
We're not talking to you as planners. You're also citizens, and all of us have an obligation as American citizens to do something about this in our role as citizens. The segregation of our communities, Lincoln, Omaha, and everywhere in the country, was done by our government in our name in a blatantly unconstitutional fashion. And as citizens, we have an obligation to do something about it, joining together with others, not just in our own profession, but in all professions and walks of life, to create community groups that will take the kind of action necessary to enact these kinds of reforms.
Well, that wraps up our conversation with Richard and Leah Rothstein. We want to thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on Booked on Planning.